This is actually, some ways, a fascinating topic, but in others, maybe not as relevant anymore, since we just don't see many socialist societies in the true sense of the word out there anymore. So that's good, that's progress, right? Unfortunately, the idea of socialism still seems to have a pull on people's imagination and people's idealism, which is rather unfortunate. But Mises himself recognized this, and in his book, Socialism, from 1922, way back, I just want to read this great quote by him. He says, "Whatever our view of its utility or its practicability, it must be admitted that the idea of socialism is at once grandiose and simple. Even its most determined opponents will not be able to deny it a detailed examination. We may say, in fact, that it is one of the most ambitious creations of the human spirit. The attempt to erect society on a new basis while breaking with all the traditional forms of social organization, to conceive a new world plan and foresee the form which all human affairs must assume in the future. This is so magnificent, so daring, that it has rightly aroused the greatest of admiration." That's Mises. It's pretty remarkable. Probably if I read you this thing, you would say, oh, you know, it's like Lenin or somebody. But Mises, he understood the appeal of socialism. And that's why he took it so seriously, why he thought it had to be dealt with in a very serious manner. Now, let me just quickly set up a bit of history here. So, you know, socialist ideas, of course, have been around for a very long time. We started seeing a rise in seriousness of ideas of socialism in the 18th and especially 19th century. And initially, a lot of these ideas were, you know, pretty far-fetched. People thought the idea was always that you could solve scarcity, overcome scarcity by eliminating private property. That's really at the core, at the core of all socialist ideas, was that you can eliminate scarcity by eliminating private property. Though initially, these ideas were, like I said, very far-fetched, and there were a lot of utopians. And they talked about, you know, lakes of lemonade and fried chickens flying through the air, and you just pluck them out, right? These really ridiculous notions. And Marx would have none of that. Marx was greatly drawn to socialism, but what he thought was necessary was a system of scientific socialism. So he devoted himself to coming up with exactly such a thing. And he was extremely well read. He spent years and years of his life holed up in a library for 12 hours at a time. He read all that was written in economics, in sociology, philosophy. He really knew his stuff, right? And he built this entire conception of scientific socialism by pulling from all these different disciplines, which is why it was so powerful, why it was so appealing to so many people. It was a holistic approach, right? This approach to understanding history and the world that came from the sort of the apex of all knowledge of the mid-19th century. But still, at the very core of it was the idea that by getting rid of private property, we can solve the problem of scarcity. And that by eliminating production, as Marx called it, for profit, and substituting, in fact, he actually called it a production for exchange, right? And replacing it with production for use, we're no longer going to have any scarcity. And we're going to live in a world of plenty where everybody, in fact, is going to be equally well off, and everybody will be very well off. That was the notion. That's what Marx believed in, and what, in fact, early Austrians all strove to dispel, right, to contradict. In particular, so you know, the Austrian School of Economics starts off with Karl Menger in the late 19th century. His students, in turn, were Eugen von Bombauer and Friedrich Wieser. And Pongracic has a whole critique of Marxism. Wieser is also there talking about these things. And Wieser in particular, I think, is the more interesting one for, well, few different reasons. But Wieser talks about scarcity. He's the one that really has the first thorough look at the nature of scarcity. But all three of these guys said, look, scarcity is not the result of private property. Scarcity is how we manage. Sorry, private property, let me rephrase that. So private property is not the cause of scarcity. Private property is how we manage scarcity, right? Private property and market exchange is how we are able to, in fact, deal with scarcity, right? So that's a big disagreement between Austrian economics and this Marxist perspective, socialist perspective in general, which held that if we can just get rid of the need for profit, then there is going to be plenty for everybody. All right, now I'm giving you a bit of a historical story here, so I want to explain how these ideas developed. All right, and socialism, despite these critiques by Pongracic and Wieser, it was still becoming the dominant perspective, dominant view of the world for more and more people, certainly in the academia and certainly in Europe of the early 20th century rather. Mises was coming along at this point. He was a young man in the early 20th century. He actually got his PhD in 1906, if I remember correctly. And he published his first book, Theory of Money and Credit, in 1912. And then he was actually pulled into World War I, and he fought for the entire 4 years of the war on the Eastern Front, and was decorated for bravery under fire 3 times, actually. You may not know that about Mises, but he was not just a desk jockey. He was fierce, right? He was a warrior. And this is why he never backed down from a fight after that. So as soon as he returned from the war, once the Axis powers were defeated in 1918, he resumed with his work. And there was a really big push after World War I in Austria, which was now broken up from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Austria itself was a much smaller country, greatly weakened, right? There was a major push to, in fact, convert Austria into a fully socialist country like they did with Russia in 1917, right? So there were all sorts of people that were trying to do that. And Mises fought tooth and nail to prevent that. In fact, there were several attempts to fully nationalize all industry in Austria. And Mises actually had a great deal of influence at that time and was able to, well, he wasn't the only voice, but he was one of the most potent voices that prevented that happening. So there was a great push to implement socialism after this horrific war, the First World War, right, the Great War as it was known then. And Mises really went out of his way to fight these ideas. And so he came out with this article in 1920 called Economic Calculation in Socialist Commonwealth. And in this article, he attacked the theoretical foundations of socialism. He said, rational socialism is an impossibility because it is impossible to have rational economic calculation under socialism. Now, wow, that was a big deal because economists simply did not attack the very theoretical basis of socialism prior to that. This was the opening salvo of what came to be known as the socialist calculation debate, in which would go on for the next 20-some years. Okay? Now, why did Mises say this? Well, he said, look, economic calculation is something that is absolutely necessary in any society. What is it? Well, it's being able to decide how best to allocate scarce resources among competing uses, right? Because there are multiple uses for all scarce resources. And how do we do that in a society? Notice that what has to be done, we have to actually assess past results, how were these resources used in the past, and then also determine what the expected future outcomes are, if the resources are employed in this way or that way. Those are the two things that have to be evaluated. Has it been used well, wisely in the past? And what's the best use in the future as we move forward? Okay? That's the economic calculation problem. Now, in a market system, we have prices that help us make those rational economic decisions, right? Friedrich Wieser explained that we must have a way of, as he put it, calculating individual marginal evaluations. Okay, so that's a big part of modern economics, is that we all put marginal evaluations on certain goods. It depends how much of that good you already have. That determines the marginal evaluation. That's ultimately what goes into determination of prices. Prices reflect those marginal evaluations, you see? And that's why they're so important. Mises explained that these meaningful market prices, can somebody get the door in the back? It's kind of loud out there. I think that's probably going to seep into the microphone. Thank you, Kyle. So Mises explained that the only way that meaningful prices can be established is ultimately through private property and through free market exchange. And of course, that's the part that socialism is incapable of doing. Why? Because socialism, by definition, means absence of private property rights in capital, in means of production, right? Socialism requires that we get rid of private property and we get rid of money. If you have no private property in capital, and if you have no money with which you can exchange, well, then there is no market. And in the absence of a market, there is no way to establish any sort of economically rational price for these different capital goods, you see? So Mises' point is that therefore the central planners in a socialist society will have no idea how to best use these scarce resources. They're blind. Without market-generated prices, they have no idea how best to use scarce resources. They have no idea of what the individual marginal evaluations are of all of these different resources available to them. Okay? Thus, according to Mises, in socialism, central planners are going to be fundamentally incapable of handling scarcity, right? They will have no ability to engage in economic calculation, and therefore an economically rational socialism is an impossibility. Chaotic socialism is certainly a possibility, and of course that's what we observed with every real-world attempt at true socialism, right, where the government fully nationalizes the industry. And I'm talking about Soviet Union here, China until about 20 years ago, North Korea, those kinds of countries, right? What they all have in common is that they were abject failures at feeding and clothing their people. Starvation was common. There was a lack of growth of any kind. So besides all the oppression, of course, that socialism caused, there was an abject economic failure in every one of these instances. Now Mises predicted this. He actually called it in 1920. 3 years into the existence of Soviet Union, and by the way, those first 3 years was the period of what we now call war socialism. From 1917 to 1921, Soviet Union was going through civil war. And there was not really a full attempt to implement socialism there. The communists, the Bolsheviks, were actually able to get rid of money because they hyperinflated, and they were trying to fight, the royalist forces, loyal to the Tsar, and they needed more funds, so they just started running the printing presses, and they killed off the money system. And they thought, wow, this is great. The first part of socialism is to get rid of money. And we accomplished that without even meaning to. This is going to be a piece of cake, right? And then there was mass starvation by 1921, and actually Lenin had to do what he called, take a step back in order to be able to take 2 steps forward in the future. And they reintroduced private property. This is what came to be known as the new economic policy. But Mises, even before that, before anything, because nobody really knew what was going on in the Soviet Union at that time, right? It was this faraway place, crazy things were going on, the Civil War, and news reports were not very common from there. So Mises was writing completely in a theoretical vacuum. He was not basing this insight on any observation, empirical observation of what was going on. It was strictly a theoretical prediction. And my gosh, did he nail it or what? Right? He absolutely called it. That's what we have seen happen, exactly. Incidentally, Mises also dealt with the incentive problem of a socialist state. And that's the one that usually people tend to go to first when critiquing socialism. Mises did not. Mises, it was all about this calculation problem, which is ultimately one of information, of knowledge, as Hayek would soon come to explain. Bless you. But Mises did recognize the problem with incentives in a socialist economy as well. So what he explained is that the managers, in particular in socialist enterprises, would have very screwed up incentives. Ultimately, a situation where managers were neither owners nor responsible to any owners, we would have massive inefficiencies everywhere because these managers would start acting in very reckless ways. They would take great risks and would actually make terrible decisions, almost certainly, over and over again, that would lead to waste, massive waste of resources. So he understood the incentive problem, but he said that was really, to him, that was not the primary problem. The primary problem was the calculation problem. That's what the socialist economy would be incapable of solving. All right, so Mises actually follows this 1920 article, which, by the way, caused a heck of a stir and probably really damaged his academic career, considerably. He was unable to ever, after that, even though everybody recognized that he was if not the most insightful, one of the most insightful and brightest economists of his generation, he was never able to get a full university appointment in Austria. Okay? Why? Who knows? But a lot of people have speculated, and I think there's a lot to it, that being such an unabashed enemy of socialist ideas cost him, because those were the ideas that were, of course, very popular in European academia at that time. So that was a bad move on his part, but Mises didn't care really about that stuff. He always spoke the truth and did not really worry about the consequences of that. So he wrote this article in 1920, and then he followed it up in 1922 with this huge book, 600-700 pages, I forget exactly, very large book, called Socialism. And there he goes much deeper. He looks at every aspect of what a socialist society would look like, not just the economic aspects. He goes into all sorts of sociological aspects, political aspects, and it's an incredible thing reading this book, because it's almost like a report on Soviet Union or China. He called it in every possible way. And again, this was all way before we saw any of these things happen. In particular, I want to focus on one aspect of the book, which is that he explained that the difference between those that buy into socialism and those that do not is one of a static versus the dynamic view of the world. Socialism assumes that the world is basically a static place, that it does not change very much, right? But in the real economic world, of course, change is constant. Change is constant. As soon as time passes, change happens. You can think of change in terms of just population, right? In terms of production processes, in terms of available resources, in terms of preferences that people have. All of these things are constantly changing. So how do we adapt to those changes? How do we respond to those changes? And what Mises pointed out is that as things change, the subjective marginal evaluations of the consumers are also going to change, inevitably. Right? When we have different alternatives, we are going to respond differently to these alternatives, and we'll value different things differently. So, his point again is that without prices, central planners in a socialist economy are lost. They cannot know what those changing evaluations are. Meanwhile, in a market system, we have prices, which change to reflect those changing subjective marginal evaluations that we put on different goods and resources. And those prices can serve as guideposts for entrepreneurs. You see? So Mises really emphasizes the role of time in the economy. Time implies change, and change implies uncertainty. And that's the big issue always in any society. How do we handle uncertainty? Uncertainty requires speculation, people to just try things. Now, speculation in a centrally planned system will have to be done by central planners. But central planners, like in Soviet Union, you had this organization called Gosplan, or bureaucracy called Gosplan. And I think it consisted of 12 people, and they made decisions. They would set up 5-year plans on everything that was going to be produced in the entire country for these next 5 years. Okay, I think population of Soviet Union in the 1950s was about 150 million people. Imagine 12 people determining the activities of 100+ million people for the next 5 years. I don't know about you, but I have a hard time figuring out just what I'm going to be doing a week from today, sometimes, right? And that's just me, my own activities. What folly. Unbelievable that anybody could think that such a thing was possible. And yet that's exactly what they were doing. But notice, because the Central Planning Bureau, these central planners would have to then themselves speculate. What happens if they get it wrong? Disaster ensues, right? Because it's a whole plan together. And if you get one part of it wrong, almost certainly there are going to be massive repercussions for every other part of the economy. You see? How do we handle uncertainty in a market system? Through entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs freely assume the speculative aspect on themselves, right? They assume it voluntarily, and they assume it because they think that they have a greater insight into some small aspect of our lives than anybody else. As the expression goes, they put their money where their mouth is, right? They say, this is the way the future is going to be, at least in this segment of the economy, or this segment of the society. And I'm going to bet on it. And if I get it wrong, I'm out of a bunch of money. I suffer the consequences. If I get it right, I'm rewarded for this. But notice, I'm not the only one that benefits from it. If I get it right, it's because I better anticipated the demands of the consumers than any of my competitors. So all of you are better off as well. all of you are better off because I was better at handling uncertainty. As I talked about in my lecture yesterday on entrepreneurship, as Mises put it, the thing that entrepreneurs do better than the rest of us is, as he put it, do you remember what the phrase was? Anybody? What do entrepreneurs do?
Step into the fog.
What?
Was it stepping into the fog of uncertainty?
Right, pierce the fog of ignorance, right? Or you can just substitute uncertainty. That's where they have a superiority, right? And where the rest of us are like, oh, no thanks. We'd rather not. Because it's dangerous, right? It puts you, it exposes you to risk. And some people naturally assume that risk and say, fine, we'll assume it if there are rewards on the other end. We think we can handle it. Notice if they are wrong, their errors are contained to just that small segment of the economy. And inevitably, we're going to have a multitude of entrepreneurs trying to do that at the same time. And almost certainly, some of them are going to get it right. Those that get it right, they're quickly going to be emulated. Those that got it wrong, they quickly abandon their failed anticipation of the future and move on to what has been proven to be right. So think about what's happening here. We have this system that is so much more responsive to failure, that is so much more, it has a much better corrective aspect to it, or correcting failures, which failures are unavoidable, right? To be human, what's the expression? To be human is to err, right? Well, do you want the erring to be done by individual entrepreneurs, or do you want the erring to be done by 12 central planners? That's the question. And that's the thing that Mises was really trying to emphasize. So there is a great deal of, again, responsibility that owners have in a private enterprise system. If they screw it up, they are directly responsible and they will be made worse off. So they are going to have much greater incentive to ensure that what they're doing is right, even though, of course, sometimes they will still get it wrong. So notice again that prices, what we talked about on Tuesday, what I talked about in my lecture on the market process, prices provide a compass, right? Prices provide a way to guide all of this decision making. And really, what that means is to choose among thousands of possibilities of use of different scarce resources. How do we ensure that these resources are used in an economically rational way? Well, the only way, this is Mises's point, the only way is through the market process, is through private ownership and market prices. There is no alternative. Unless you want to consider chaos and poverty as an alternative, right? That's the alternative. You either have markets and market prices, or you've got chaos and poverty. So that was Mises's case. For a while, there was no response, which is pretty surprising, or maybe not so much, because it was really difficult to know what to say to an argument like that. And ultimately, what the real hardcore socialists did is they just ignored him. They said, well, you know what, he's bringing up these points, and we don't really know what to say to that. But look, Soviet Union is doing it. So what do we care, right? It's actually happening, and we don't know exactly how they're doing it, but they're doing it. So God bless Lenin, God bless Stalin, they're figuring it out. Interestingly enough, and this was very surprising to Mises, who ended up ultimately responding to him, was not the hardcore socialists from all of these different social sciences. It was actually his fellow economists. And Mises thought of himself as being very much within the mainstream of modern economics in the 1920s, certainly in the early 1920s. Now all of a sudden you had all of these economists that said, well, Mises brings up some interesting points, but there is a way to achieve rational socialism by using all of these tools that we've developed in modern economics, mathematical tools, right? So the general equilibrium model can provide guidance here, because what we simply need to do, we need to gather enough data to be able to plug that data into our supply and demand equations and figure out what the prices would be in the absence of private ownership of capital. You see, so simple, right? So we have our models of the way the economy works. We have equations for supply. We have equations for demand. We know, we have to simply solve them all together. And all that we need is just the data to plug into all of that. And if we can collect that data, then we can mathematically solve the problem of economic calculation. We don't actually have to have private ownership of capital, because that's ultimately the big bugaboo in socialist thought, right? As long as there's private ownership of capital, there's going to be exploitation of the proletariat, right, the workers, by the capitalists. So that's the thing that has to be done away with. So all of these economists that were quite attracted to socialist thought started thinking in terms of how can we use the tools of modern economics to answer Mises. And that was the first attempt. Now, Mises does not actually really reply. He sort of disengages from this debate. Instead, he's got a surrogate. Who's that? Hayek, that's right. Mises' student. Hayek gets his PhD, mid-20s, I think 25. Mises actually is responsible for giving his first job. There is the Austrian Bureau of Business Cycle Research. I think it's something like that. And Hayek actually gets the job of the first director of this organization. And then actually starts writing on prices and production, starts writing about some more technical stuff, gets a job at London School of Economics by 1932-33. But Hayek is very much doing Misesian economics, and there are some people within Austrian economics that have a real problem with this, and if they see this video, they're probably going to be really upset. But there's no shadow of a doubt in my mind that Hayek was the greatest proponent of Misesian economics in history, right? No other person has done Misesian economics as well as Hayek. And all of these differences that people point to between them, he was trying to add. He wasn't just parroting Mises, he was trying to add to what Mises was doing. So anyway, Hayek gets involved in this particular debate. And to all these guys that had by 1930, early 30s, started saying, look, we just need a quantitative way of figuring out how to overcome the economic calculation problem, right? Through these quantitative methods, we can do it. And this is where Hayek joins the debate and says, look, you guys are really missing the point. That's not the way the real world works. You have a real lack of attention to detail, all right? That's the problem here. And he goes through several points. First, in any complex economy, we have thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of products that are exchanged on daily basis, right? How are central planners going to derive enough information, enough relevant data to specify these demand and supply equations to actually solve a system of thousands of simultaneous equations? Right? If you know very much about math, the more equations you have that you have to solve simultaneously, the more difficult it becomes, right? And of course, that was way before computers, or certainly supercomputers, and it was unthinkable to be actually able to do something like that. But also just the nature of the data that the central planners would need to collect. Well, this data is of subjective nature, right? How are you going to extract that from us? And oftentimes it's data that we are not aware of ourselves until the moment of choice, right? You are in a store and you go, oh, darn, do I want gum or do I want mints? Gum costs this much, mints cost this much. I don't know. What do I want? I'll take mints. Right? Now imagine somebody coming to you with like a 50-page document. All right, if this is the price, would you prefer this or that? I don't know. I mean, it would be just completely bizarre to think that you could gather this kind of data. But yet, that's what these guys were suggesting, right? The second point that Hayek brought up is that production depends less on these objective recipes. And that's how socialists always think about this stuff. Oh, we'll figure out the optimal way of producing a particular good, and then we can just follow that into eternity, right? Into infinity. We'll just continue to do that over and over again. Wait a minute, that's not how that works, right? Production processes are not really recipes. They're really ways of thinking, ways of dealing with new problems that inevitably crop up. That's what production processes are. I mean, if you actually go into any real-world company, you know, they don't have like a very set steps. Okay, you will do this, and this way. It's changing all the time. You see, and that is something that a socialist economy that these guys were proposing would be utterly incapable of dealing with. It would be incapable of dealing with change, as Mises pointed out. You would just have one way of doing things, and that's all you would have. And then Hayek also brings up the incentive problem, but he puts a different spin on it from Mises. He actually says that the problem here is not that the managers would be reckless. It's that they would have a very hard time justifying any kind of speculation. In other words, if they take a risk and things go badly, how are they going to justify to their superiors, to the central planners, God forbid, to Stalin himself, right, why they took this step, why they took that risk? And they're not going to be able to, right? So in fact, Hayek makes the opposite point. He says, you can actually have complete stifling of initiative. Managers being frozen with fear, maybe, certainly under Stalin they were, right? That if they undertake a particular risk, a particularly different way of doing something that's supposed to make things better, if it goes wrong, they've got a big problem. They will be held responsible for it, and that means in Soviet Union, Siberia. If not just an overnight disappearance, never to be seen by anybody again. Okay? So Hayek, in fact, makes in this first article on the socialist calculation debate, makes a very Misesian point. He says, I'll just quote this. So this is from 1935, this article. It says, the essential thing about the market system is that it does react to some extent to all those small changes and differences which would have to be deliberately disregarded under socialism if the calculations were to be manageable. In this way, rational decisions would be impossible in all those questions of detail, which in the aggregate decide the success of productive effort. Right? So Hayek is saying, if you try to just gather all of this data, you would be completely lost because you could not manage all the details of this. And that's, of course, where the devil is. Okay? Meanwhile, in markets, that's exactly what we see. We see continual marginal adjustments to these small changes that are happening constantly. In every enterprise, it's happening multiple times every day, right? Small adjustments to changes in the circumstances. So it's never like this one big thing. It's a continuous adjustment. And that's ultimately what accounts for this great adaptability of the market system and the success of the market system, is that people are constantly reacting to changes. Now, Mises and Hayek are then both answered by this guy by the name of Oskar Lange, Polish economist, very accomplished economist, Oskar Lange, or Lange, and take your pick, writes an article in 1936 and then a book in 1938 where he is aware of these problems, and he dismisses the quantitative solution to the calculation problem. He says, we're never going to be able to have enough data. We can't collect this data. But there is another way. And he proposes that instead we have nationalization of capital, and then the Central Planning Bureau set the prices at which they rent the capital, all of these machines, right, and productive goods, productive resources. They rent these things to enterprises. So the enterprises don't just get them, they have to compete for them, okay? And then what the Central Planning Bureau has to do is it has to set the price on the basis of good economic theory, which is that if there is a surplus in a particular market for this machine, they have to lower the price, the rental price, right? If there is a shortage, if there is excess demand in a particular market, then they have to increase the price. So he says we can approximate a market economy by in fact having government ownership of capital, but the government then, in the form of this Central Planning Bureau, will determine what the right price should be by in fact letting the bidding process take place between all of these different enterprises, the managers of those enterprises who say, well, I have to make this, so I actually I'm willing to bid that much for this machine, which will help me make that. But somebody else says, well, wait a minute, I would like that machine too. That will help me accomplish my purposes here. So I'm willing to bid a little bit more. You see? And where the equilibrium price arises, that's where we're going to have market clearing, where there's not going to be excess supply or excess demand. And it's all set. You see? Then we have proper, rational use of scarce resources. That was Lange's perspective on this, and there's more to it than that, but in a nutshell, that was his proposal for having what he called a system of market socialism, which is a bizarre concept anyway. It's like, if it's socialism, it's absence of markets, right? Markets require private ownership. You don't have that here, right? So just because they're playing around with prices, that does not make it a market. Anyway, Lange even took a bit of a shot at Mises in this article, in this 1936 article, and I have to read you this quote, okay? He says, socialists have certainly good reason to be grateful to Professor Mises, the great advocates diabolic, right, so devil's advocate, of their cause. For it was his powerful challenge that forced the socialists to recognize the importance of an adequate system of economic accounting to guide the allocation of resources in a socialist economy. Here's the kicker. Both as an expression of recognition for the great service rendered by him, and as a memento of the prime importance of sound economic accounting, a statue of Professor Mises ought to occupy an honorable place in the Great Hall of the Ministry of Socialization or of the Central Planning Board of the Socialist State. Ah, you bastard. Right, snide jerk. Now, the irony, of course, is that in Poland, the building that used to be occupied by the Central Planning Board, if I remember this correctly, you can look this up. I think I've got it right, but I'm not 100% sure. In Poland, the building that used to be occupied by the Central Planning Board was occupied, I don't know if it still is, it ended up being after the collapse of communism. It was used by a free market institute, and they actually had a bust of Mises there. So and that was a nice bit of revenge there. Who gets the last laugh here? But you can see that certainly these guys took Mises very seriously. Now this really unleashed Hayek. Hayek went kind of nuts at this point, right? And he wrote a series of articles over the next 10 years that are really some of the most important articles in Austrian economics, I would say, where he really explains the nature of knowledge and the nature of the knowledge problem that markets solve. Okay, and here's how he starts off. So by the way, these articles, in 1936, Economics and Knowledge, in 1940, The Competitive Solution. Here's the big one. In 1945, anybody know which one? The Use of Knowledge in Society. Right, that's the one that even non-Austrians read and praise, though they don't quite get it. They miss a big part of it. Okay, and then in 1946, The Meaning of Competition. And ultimately, way later in 1968, competition as a discovery procedure. All right, so in these 5 articles, Hayek is responding in particular to Lange, and then broader to socialist, these proposals in general. But he starts off by first pointing out that it is impossible to even define all of the capital goods that we use in a market economy, that are used in production. What is all a capital good? Do we know? No, we can't specify all of those things. Sometimes it's really bizarre things that capitalists will use for the production process. Sometimes, like just everyday household objects ended up being used in the production process. That was not designed, right? It would be impossible to set prices through this trial and error way, right, that Lange proposes for every capital good. What about like a screwdriver? What about tiny little screws, right, versus a little bit bigger screws? Versus like really big screws, right? Are they going to go through this kind of a bidding process for every one of these capital goods? My God, think about that. What a nightmare that would be, right? All the way up to like cranes or some massive machines. It would be thousands and thousands of bidding things at once, and you would still have the Central Planning Bureau that would be fully in charge of that and having to deal with it. It's just not workable. More importantly, prices in this scheme still could not adjust quickly enough to actually reflect all those changing conditions, right? So again, lack of immediate adjustment that we very much have in a marketplace. So in a marketplace, prices are continuously undergoing a myriad of small adjustments, right? Made by actual buyers, by actual sellers in response to changing conditions. All of those prices are contextual, right? They are dependent on what is actually going on at that very moment in the markets. And they are not objective, really, in that sense, in the sense that they are reflecting some perfect reality. They're shifting. They're constantly changing in order to provide for this changing reality. So Hayek, in fact, accuses Lange of an excessive preoccupation with the pure theory of the stationary equilibrium. This idea, and this is where Austrians really first started getting really upset with the equilibrium ideas that mainstream economics is still so based on, that it so heavily relies on. And Austrians said, look, the markets are actually not always in an equilibrium. In fact, probably they're almost always in disequilibrium. And equilibrium is ever only approached, not necessarily ever achieved, right? So if we are outside of the equilibrium, what happens to all of these notions that you have? They're worthless, okay? That's not the way the real world works. He also emphasizes the importance of specialized, particularized knowledge for the efficient operation of the economic system, okay, of the market system. And here's his great contribution, what has come to be known as the knowledge problem, right? The fact that economically relevant knowledge is dispersed among millions of people in the society, right? We all, first of all, know what we like, what we want, and what the trade-offs are that we are willing to make. That's the first thing we know. Second thing we know is we all know something different about how to contribute to the productive process than anybody else. Right? We all contribute our tiny bits of know-how, as Leonard Reed mentioned in iPencil. And that's the part that Lange doesn't get. This knowledge that the market system relies on is different knowledge than that found in the books on the shelves of a library. Right? It is the detailed knowledge of, as Hayek put it, of time and place. Knowing something about the immediate context within which we are working that ultimately decides the success or failure of a particular productive enterprise, right? That's what's necessary for economic calculation. Sometimes this knowledge is later on, Hayek added this notion, sometimes this knowledge is actually tacit. Tacit means it's inarticulable, that you know things, but you don't know how to explain it to somebody else. Playing a musical instrument is like that, right? If you play an instrument and you play and somebody says, how'd you do that? Well, I don't know, just practiced, right? And at some point you're able to do something. You see, but also there are a lot of other things. Probably everybody's been in a situation where somebody asked you for directions, and maybe on a route that you have traveled hundreds of times, right? And you know it like the back of your hand, but usually you forget the street names, right? So you go, well, okay, it's not, you know, it's easy. You just turn right like 2 blocks after the light. I don't know what the name of that street is, and then you go for about half a mile, and then there's that restaurant with a clown on it, and you turn left there, and you go, that's okay, I'll find it on my own, right? That's tacit knowledge. It's something that you could do almost with your eyes closed, but explaining it to somebody else is a very different matter. And so much of the economic process is dependent also on this tacit knowledge. You see, that leads to the knowledge problem, right? That economically important knowledge is dispersed among all individuals, among multitudes of economic actors. How do we overcome this knowledge problem? We've got to have competition as a discovery procedure, right? That's how we overcome it. Ultimately, prices are not enough. And that's the thing that like Lange didn't get. It's not enough. How much time do I have, Anthony? Anthony, how much time do I have?
Just 5 minutes, okay?
Yeah, 10 would be better. See, scarcity. Darn it. I should be able to finish it up. All right, so prices are not enough. Prices are a compass. They're a guidepost, right? They're guideposts, in fact, plural. But what you need to do is you need to combine the information that prices convey, which is never very clear, incidentally. It needs to be interpreted. And that depends on the knowledge that different entrepreneurs will have. So what needs to happen is the knowledge that entrepreneurs have, if they in fact have superior knowledge about a particular market, about what we want, combining the knowledge that they themselves have with the information conveyed by prices, they're able to make successful decisions. But in the absence of a way to pull together all of this dispersed knowledge through the productive effort and competing efforts of different entrepreneurs, there's no way to have rational economic calculation. And we still face the same, in socialism I should say, still faces the same problem. Inability to solve this economic calculation problem. The market process is ultimately the only way to access the knowledge necessary to have rational economic calculation. That was the point that both Mises and Hayek were making. All right, so what's the conclusion here? Well, the socialist calculation debate revealed to Austrians, to Mises and Hayek, 2 things. First, that they were pretty different from the rest of the profession. Both Mises and Hayek thought of themselves as, in fact, being part of the mainstream. By the end of the 1940s into the early 40s, it was very clear to them that they're different, that they are not doing the same kind of economics that the rest of the economics profession was doing. And that's when Mises really started writing a lot more about the proper methodology of economics, and where Hayek actually started getting interested in these broader social issues, what's happening in society, the rules of the game and stuff like that. The second thing that it did, the socialist calculation debate, was that it forced Mises and Hayek to develop a better theory of the market process, which they did. And Mises certainly, in fact, did a lot more in Human Action, which came out in 1949, and was certainly informed both by the work of Hayek, but also by the socialist calculation debate. But by the 1940s, the economics profession had decided that ultimately Mises and Hayek had lost the socialist calculation debate. The consensus was that socialism is possible, and socialism through these things that Lange and some of the other ones were saying, it could solve the socialist calculation problem. Interestingly enough, Lange became a pretty high up guy in the post-communist, or in the communist, I should say, Poland. He never actually tried to institute anything along the lines of what he was proposing in this article. They adopted the Stalinist system of these 5-year plans until the bitter end, right, until the whole thing collapsed in 1989. Imagine the shock of all of these economists when, in fact, communism did start collapsing in the late 80s, right? In fact, when they saw this, the New York Times, this is this December 9th, 1991, declaring death of Soviet Union, Russia and 2 republics form new Commonwealth. That must have just blown their minds. And in fact, there were at least some of these mainstream economists, socialist mainstream economists, they were willing to admit that they were wrong. And most notably, there was this guy by the name of Robert Heilbronner. Robert Heilbronner was a distinguished, respected economist that happened to be more or less a socialist. And he wrote this book actually called The Worldly Philosophers, which was all about the lives of some distinguished economists, going back to Adam Smith and all of these people. And Heilbronner wrote a couple of pieces in the New Yorker dealing with the collapse of socialism. In 1989, he wrote, "Capitalism has won," which was a pretty shocking admission by him because he was not a fan of capitalism. Here's in that same article, here's actually a different article a little bit later, next year in 1990. This is great. He says, "Socialism has been a great tragedy this century, but collapse? No one expected collapse. There is no doubt that the collapse marks the end of socialism as a model of economic clarity." And he says then, it turns out, that's my phone, sorry about that, it's vibrating. And he says, it turns out, of course, that Mises was right. He actually wrote that. And that's a pretty amazing thing because most people don't really want to admit it, but they ultimately get to that point where they come to realize that Mises was right. In this one instance, we had explicit acknowledgement that Mises was right. So hopefully that clarifies a little bit of why socialism doesn't work, why it ultimately collapsed. Do I have any time for questions? Okay, let's just take 1 or 2 questions. Anything? Yeah.
So given the knowledge problem in subjective value theory, what can mathematical modeling and computer simulation tell us about economy or economic behavior?
Most Austrians would say not much. And we're pretty critical of that kind of stuff. I don't want to go to the extreme and say nothing. But I think there is certainly way too much faith put into these kinds of things today. And certainly if these tools were as potent as a lot of economists think they are, how do you explain what happened in 2008? Why was such a thing allowed to happen, right? And incidentally, no economist saw it coming, except actually a few more Austrian types again, right? But no mainstream economists were warning of an imminent collapse of the housing market and near collapse of the entire financial sector. What good are these tools of forecasting if you can't predict and forecast the most serious economic calamity, arguably, since the Great Depression, right? It does not instill confidence. Let's just put it that way. But so I'll just say maybe they're good for something, but I'm not convinced. Any other questions? Yes.
So it seems like a large part of the problem with socialism was the inability to calculate. Given the expanding capacity of us to process data using supercomputers and such, and our expanding ability to gather data, what would you say to, I guess, a socialist trying to make the case that this makes socialism more viable?
Right. In fact, subsequent economists, in particular Rothbard, he's dealt with that quite a bit. And the basic fundamental problem still remains, which is that the data that is necessary to solve the economic calculation problem is data that is ultimately elusive to us, that we cannot get ever. Because it's data that's contextual always, right? And that is the subjective marginal evaluations. Now, if you know much about the marginalist way of thinking, which of course is part of all modern economics, right? It explains that there is such a thing as law of diminishing marginal utility, right? So how much value you put on something very much depends, among other things, how much you've already had to consume of it. Right? So, whereas you may put a very high value in the first unit of something, you're going to have much less value in the 10th unit of that, okay? And that is changing all the time depending on the circumstances, right? So it's not like we are able to collect data and say, okay, well, here's our data for the year. No, it's meaningless, right? And incidentally, as I pointed out in my lecture, it's something that is very much unknown to us until the moment of decision, of choice, usually, right? We don't know exactly how we evaluate these things until we are confronted with those choices. So it's not like you can, in fact, even rank all the different goods, and say, okay, well, I prefer this to that to that. No, how much of this to how much of that? And what about the 10th unit of this versus the 100th unit of that, right? These are not stable preferences. They are very much non-existent until the moment of choice. So it's not data that can ever be collected. You see, it's data that's ultimately reflected in prices through our actual decision making. When we are confronted with the choices, we say, yes, I'm going to buy that, or no, I'm not going to buy that, I'm going to buy something else. And that's why the information contained in prices is so important. The price system is a giant calculating computer. That's what it is. And you will never be able to substitute it with anything else because nothing else can collect the data as the price system. You see what I'm trying to say here? So that's the problem. It doesn't matter what our calculating abilities are. There's always going to be the fundamental problem of inability to collect that data. Unless there's some kind of a chip, in 200 years that can read our minds, right? And know exactly all of our choices before we actually have to make them. I'm not holding my breath. Besides, I'm going to be dead. So, all right, I better quit. So thank you very much. Hope you find that interesting.